playing?
Sort of. I mean, don't
Right.
touch me on
Yeah, that's cool, man.
It just sounds pretty, but don't mess with me. I feel that one
All right, Ray.
Yep. Yeah. I'm starting. We have boot camp next month. I really just started.
Video balls enough if you want it.
No, so I'm
Bring you talking for a little bit to start with the thing.
Yeah. But I'm going to start taking the next one for sure. Yeah. Oh. Some people so that's why I was starting.
Easy.
Oh, nice.
pretty names here.
Oh,
Might not happen.
Okay, so we've been talking about stabilization of the core, the spine, right? We talked about that last week. We talked about deep abdominal stabilization using transverse abdominis and how to, the drill we used to kind of activate that. So then the question came up talking about SI joint dysfunction. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the SI joint and all the things that are kind of involved in that. All right, so the way we look at the SI joint, we typically talk about it like the little knobby bones at the top of the pelvis, right? That's kind of your indicator spot. So when people are like, oh, it hurts right here, typically there is something going on in the scope of the SI joint, okay? But realistically, it's where the sacrum comes in contact with the ilium. So this entire section is SI joint, okay? So if we look at, there's two things that we look at with the SI joint. One, something that's called form coupling. Form coupling is the actual shape of the bones and the ligament system that are keeping that joint somewhat stable, okay? So these are the basics of our form coupling, right? We've got all of these ligaments attaching at all sorts of different angles, right? The SI joint does move, but it moves like less than 2 millimeters. I mean, it moves just a little bit. It's got just enough shear to allow you to kind of go through your normal gait without being locked down, okay? But it should not have a big wonky chunk of movement. But once we jack that thing up, like just like an ankle, just like a shoulder, once we lengthen those ligaments, you're never going to get those back to the normal length, okay? So we play the secondary game, which is force coupling. Force coupling is what exists in the musculature, okay? So primary things that we think about are, okay, so there's 4 subsystems. The subsystems are realistically someone else's versions of Thomas Meyer's anatomy trains, okay? So we talked about the lateral sling before, which is made up of what?
Root knee, QL, and then adductors.
Okay, that stabilizes the pelvis in gait, right? So when one leg lifts, the pelvis stays level. When the hip drops, it's called Trendelenburg gait. It means that something isn't stabilizing that even. So that's a frontal plane issue, right? Okay. Then we have our anterior oblique sling, which is, anybody?
External oblique, internal oblique, adductor.
Adductor, okay, so we're playing another adductor game. So then we start looking, okay, there's some carryover here, right? Posterior oblique sling.
Lats, glutes.
Lat to opposite glute through the thoracolumbar fascia, okay? And the one that we haven't really talked about, which is the deep longitudinal, which is basically biceps femoris, goes into the sacrotuberal ligament, which goes from the sacrum to the tubercle, head of the femur. And then goes into the erectors, which realistically is the majority of the superficial back line. Okay. Now, there are some people that claim that that there is a little bit of glute and lat tied into that line. Okay. The reality is they're all kind of tied together. Okay. So the one thing that we want to talk about is that those slings all cross this joint, right? Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. There we go. Okay, so glute, thoracolumbar fascia, lat. Okay? That thoracolumbar fascia just lays right on top of that sacrum. Okay? If you have a shitty glute on one side, there is a higher than likelihood that you are going to create some sort of dysfunction in the pelvis if you are doing anything athletic or exercise-based, okay? If I have two perfectly great working glutes and I have a shitty deep abdominal system, I still can create that problem, okay? So we have to look at this both internally and externally. So we've been talking about the transverse abdominis. There she is. Okay, our girdle muscle, that ties all the way into the backside here. Then we look at stuff, what's the other side of that? This pelvic floor. Okay, go ahead and take a look. Go ahead and look down there. Don't feel uncomfortable. Go ahead and give it a look.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That's what I came for.
Okay. All that musculature on the pelvic floor, and then of course. One more down. Our multifidi, okay? So all of that stuff is the deepest layer of musculature that ties into the sacrum and the ilium, all right? So if we are not stabilizing the abdominal system, we're not stabilizing the pelvis, okay? So if you can't figure out what's going on in the middle, none of the other stuff's gonna matter. Eventually you're gonna create a small micro movement that's gonna throw you out of whack. The other piece, which we do discuss, but we don't necessarily discuss it in the aspect of stabilization of the pelvis, the diaphragm. Okay? That's another component of that, because you notice that these little crooks start to drive all the way down through those lumbar vertebrae. So, all of that stuff ties together as our kind of deep abdominal stabilizers. We have to be able to own those first. So, dysfunctional breathing we've talked about, right? Talked about the difference between breathing for bracing and being able to stabilize and breathe without that inflation. We have to know how to use the diaphragm. Are there questions on the diaphragm? No?
What kind of questions? Like,
On how it applies to this.
yes, how does it apply to that?
Okay, so we talked about deep abdominal stabilization and that the pelvis and the diaphragm basically face each other. The pelvic floor is basically your diaphragm in the lower half. As it contracts, it pressures up. As the diaphragm contracts, it pressures down. It pushes everything together and it creates inter-abdominal pressure. Okay? That inter-abdominal pressure is part of what generates stabilization in that sacral spinal region. So the diaphragm plays a pretty crucial role because of how integrated it is both neurologically. The nervous system ties all this stuff together. Fascially, it ties this stuff together. If we look at the myofascial, the deep frontal line, right? It ties all the way from hip flexor to pelvic floor to transverse abdominis into the diaphragm, ties all that stuff together fascially. Okay? So if those components aren't working in sync, then you're going to create some sort of energy leakage. Make sense? Okay, good. Pelvic floor. How do we fire the pelvic floor?
Glutes?
Yeah, we create some sort of a Kegel contraction, right? Or the stop yourself from peeing contraction. Okay? It's a good cue, which we talked about, being able to get someone to try to activate deep abdominal if they can't figure out what you're trying to say to them. Okay? So that brings us right back to what we were talking about last week, which was that basic entry level marching drill. Okay, that was last week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we did the lying flat down.
Yeah, and tried to draw it, and tried to isolate transverse abdominis, or at least try to activate transverse abdominis.
That
Okay,
was the week
so
before, wasn't it?
That was it, right? You got it, David.
What's up, Tom?
No, what did you do last week?
Anytime.
we're talking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Is this slight movement and the weakness of the glutes, is that what's responsible for the sciatica acting up in the first place?
Can be.
Can be.
Okay, sciatica, though, we have to be careful because that's coming from the spinal root, right? So if we have compression in the lumbar discs, or if we have rotation, or if we have some sort of bulging disc, we can piss off that sciatic nerve root way before it gets to the glute or the SI joint.
Does it go as high up as L4, 5?
It's L5S1 is that base root, right? So the moment that you piss that off, it's going to continue. But it's a good point, because if we look at how close L5 is to the sacrum, right? Which is why that space is called the L5S1, right? Disc, right between. So if you get compression there, right away you're already involved in the sacrum. You're already there. And then we have that nerve line. We've got, where's the big guy? There it is. 4, 5, minus 1. Okay, so you've got your L5 lumbosacral trunk root that comes in through there. Let's get rid of our connective tissue. Okay. That's a big ass nerve, right? Look at how all these other branches, they're tiny little things. This is like,
It's like
Godzilla.
5 times the
yeah,
size.
these are all the daisy ones, and then this is
Normal
every other
person.
average sized person. Okay,
So
so
small.
that branch comes up, and you can't really see it, but it basically feeds up into this L5. So you've got all of that stuff. If it pisses off here, it's going to continue. But then when it becomes the big chunky one is when it comes out. And then we add the musculature, and then we start dealing with, everyone talks about is our piriformis syndrome, right? So notice it comes right under that piriformis, and then if that gets tight, or if we get out of whack, it's going to pinch down, so it's going to piss that nerve off. Okay. So it's easy to say that yes, some sort of sacroiliac dysfunction is going to facilitate some sort of nerve issue, but it's not always going to be the case. Okay? But that being said, number one rule for me when I look at someone is I'm going to check to see if their pelvis is lined up first, because if it's tweaked out, guaranteed that you're going to get some sort of symptom, some sort of gum, and you're not going to be able to symmetrically find everything. Smell a mustache. Thank you. Questions on that? There's a lot of things here, so we're just getting some basic information.
Do you align their pelvis every single time, like on every single person when they come in, or
No.
when do you do it, and
If
when
I
do
have
you just
someone who came to me with chronic pain,
in just
I check it.
okay?
If I have average people that don't really have an issue and everything is moved pretty well,
Yeah.
I don't unless they're showing some sort of symptom.
Okay,
Doesn't mean that they're not out of whack
right.
when they come in, but they're not facilitating things wrong enough to create a symptom.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because we have to some degree give people the chance to move. So if we're like, oh, cleaned you up, now we got to go baby it. We don't want to play that game.
Is something as simple as leg and thigh extension going to be adequate to strengthen the glutes?
Well, I think that we start to fall victim to is the idea of strengthening versus activation. Okay. Sometimes it's not that and this is where I know we talk we go back to this, in the workshop at Kind, they talked about it, if you want to really know whether or not it's weaker, check the size, right? So you check someone's quad on the right versus the left, and they're of a ½ inch to an inch deficit. Something has been creating a cheating system that quad is weaker, smaller and weaker, right? The glute, you can usually tell. You look at someone go into a hinge pattern, you can see active one go into like a full extension. You can see the development of one versus the other. So if you see a drastic difference in activation, then there is a glaring strength issue. But if there's not a drastic symmetry issue, it may just be underactive. It may just be cheating somewhere above or below. The lumbar's working too hard, the hamstring's working too hard, the glute's not doing its job. It could be a mobility issue, could be an overactive opposite, could be hip flexor psoas is shortened and active and it's not allowing full extension of the hip. Any of that can be possible. But sometimes we have to look and say, is this a true weakness, or if we get this thing with a basic activation drill, like a clamshell or a hip bridge, can we then go, their brain figured out that they have one, right? There's a butt, and it does exist on the left side. Can we use it? So we can kind of check that. Now, if they still just look like garbage, then we load them. But it's got to be pretty glaringly asymmetric for me to give them a ratio of like a 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, or just a specific isolation of the left glute, because the body's so integrated, systemically just so connected, that me giving them a single-sided glute exercise just feels too therapeutic and isolated to me. But I think that you probably can be successful. Okay, so who has the SI problem? You have the SI problem, and Lexi has the SI problem. Okay, so let's look at you.
Yeah.
Let's look at you. Question before we start analyzing a body. Questions on any of those?
Can the nerve stuff come as a different symptom? Like maybe not like sharp or tingly, but maybe like tight, like those for
absolutely.
maintenance?
We typically, most of the research now says that muscles, all of your tension is nerve tension. The reason we hold inflexibility has 100% to do with the nerve. So
Muscles aren't necessarily.
muscle is just a rubber band,
Doesn't trust it.
right? If you take the nerve out and you take a warm piece of muscle tissue, it's you get it,
Cleaned up
right?
today. Stretches.
I didn't get it. Can you go into
Muscles
that?
they're based on cross bridges, right? Cross bridges are based on nerve activation. So you get those to contract, and you get a nerve to kind of hyper facilitate that. It's gonna turn those on. So then all of a sudden you hit these points of tension, these knots, where the body's just not releasing that nerve line, which is why we talk about myofascial release really being more about neural activation or neural stimulus than we do. Now, I think that scar tissue exists. I think adhesions in the idea of trauma or tear, you will get scarring tissue that does not act the same as healthy muscle tissue, but it's not the primary that we see. But yes, the nerve can show up as anything, right? Weakness can show up as tightness, because if a muscle is not strong, the nervous system will lock it down, right? I hinge, I don't feel strong enough to go forward. My brain is going to be like, I don't want to hit my face on the ground, so it goes, shuts the hamstring down. So what do you feel? Oh, that's it. That's what my hamstrings have. They're tight there. They're tight there maybe because they don't trust that pad. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Well, and then fear will restrict nervous activation. I mean,
Right. It's a
regardless.
sympathetic nervous response, right? Fear, tightness.
I had one client that came in totally asymmetrical in the bicep. She had injured her, she had a nerve injury that shut this bicep down for a while. And she was at least 2 inches difference between the two biceps, and not much activation. Now this is Jennifer, she comes in on Wednesdays. It's been about 2.5 years, but we got her pretty much symmetrical again.
Good.
Those nerves they'll like sprout, they'll reach out if you call them to.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing with nerve, and this is where we can talk about the SI joint too. Sling systems, talked about how superficially the sling systems all play a part in stabilization as well as deep abdominal stuff. We are able to figure things out, right? So you have people that are the gym rat type, where I'm just gonna go get it, right? Squatting today. Okay, what was my squat warm up? Well, I walked in and I put 95 on the bar and squatted, and then I put 135 on the bar and I squatted, and then I put 185 and I worked up until I got to my working weight and I squat.
Would you be less judgmental of that person if they started with the empty bar?
No.
It sort of sounds like what I did.
Is that you, Dale?
No, we've all done it.
No, of course
Look,
not.
we've all done it. I'm not saying,
Only
but
on
I'm saying it's wrong.
When I have people doing press.
I'm saying it's wrong unless you are a 100% functioning unit, right?
400
Because
plus.
unless your squat is just looks
Immediately.
like it belongs in a instructional
400
video,
cold in my Lulu ABCs.
Yeah.
and you move
I love
and you feel everything fire the right way, that warm up might work great. But if you don't, but you're like, oh, I know I've got a rotation, an asymmetric shift, and I go, well, if I just warm up enough doing that, maybe my shift will go away. You're probably wrong.
Makes
But
sense.
we can use small activation drills that are not hard. They're intentionally easy so that you can feel them. Because if you're just doing something because you go, okay, I'm gonna do this, this rotational row pull because I know that posterior oblique sling is gonna fire, and it doesn't, which means I go biceps femoris, lumbar, QL, lat. You go, well, I feel my lats, my butt's gotta be working, right? It's too much stimulus on something that doesn't know how to work yet. Where you might have been able to do basic clamshell exercise, right? Or some sort of lateral band walk to actually tell the brain, hey, this is a muscle, then gone and done that drill. So we're trying to get things to activate under very, very little because that's going to create trust in the nervous system. And then we can move bigger. Then we can put 500 on the bar and start acting like a little bitch.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Okay.
Yeah, Eric.
Yeah,
All right,
Eric.
so,
Your back is
Eric, come forward, please, sir. Come into the view of the camera. Come into the view, the show the view. Okay. You have SI pain when you squat, or just in general, maybe.
general, yeah.
Okay. So, what would you do first? You come to you from the future with still a shitty SI pain. Now you're 40, and everything hurts.
Now you're what?
Sorry.
What do you say? Oh, okay.
Stuff like the reverse hypers.
No, not there yet. Cool.
Deep abdominal breathing.
Could be. What else?
Pelvic.
Let's check the hips, right? Lay on your back. Don't make it fucking complicated. All right, so we do our basic. We bring the knees in. We just kind of even you out, pull you out, take a look, blah 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 blah. Look, you go. Yeah, he's got about a 1/4 inch shift up on the right. Okay, well, that's one thing. So let's clean that up first. Everyone, please notice the very nice Fiore pants.
Oh, both of us.
Now, as a mutual influencer.
Ryan, do you know anybody who could get those pants for a discount at all?
Not for you.
Not for you, only for ourselves
Right.
as influencers.
Yeah,
I'm looking at those socks.
All right, try to relax. Muscle energy work. Were you here when we talked about this stuff? Okay, so
Colton has no
we
idea
have
what's going
we
on.
have a pelvic shift. All right, there's a couple. If you go to a chiropractor, a lot of times chiropractor, they've got different adjustments for that. Usually can be effective, right? We use it more from a muscle energy standpoint. So if I have a pelvis that should sit like this, and when I look at it, it looks like this, okay? I want to bring this guy back forward and this guy back. So in order to do that, I'm gonna use the muscles that would move it that way, okay? If I'm backwards, the muscles of the front would pull me forward. If I'm back, I just said that. If I'm forward, the muscles on the back of the body will pull it back. So he displayed back on the right, forward on the left. So I'm going to use the muscles of his hip flexors and the muscles of his hamstrings and glutes. I'm going to have him torque against my arm and make him readjust himself. Okay? So,
Only if you do it right.
well, right. If you do it wrong, then it's just going to make it worse. Good. Or if he's not strong enough.
Yeah.
Are you strong enough?
No.
So I'm going to make him fight forward a little bit, and I have him squeeze here. It's just, if you You get a little bit of movement, you get a little bit of a pop. That's the resetting the pubic symphysis, which is the little piece of cartilage at the base of the pelvis. Cool. I do 4 or 5 of them if they're more than like a fraction off. Then I usually recheck after that and see where we're at. Squeeze. Okay, so strong and muscular and athletic. Let's see if he adjusted well. In, out. Check. We're maybe off by just a little bit. So we'll do 2 more. Big strong push pull. Good. Another squeeze.
Now sometimes I've had people
Squeeze.
strong enough,
How strong? How much do you squat?
right?
What's your heaviest squat?
470.
You're barely squeezing right. Jump.
Was that to a box?
It was a box top, Dale.
90
Don't worry about it.
You don't need to go more than 90, Dale.
No, sir.
Okay, so we'll assume they probably don't right. And then I just usually take them over and kind of give them a little lateral stretch here. Sometimes you get a little adjustment in that SI joint.
Good crack.
Okay, so anyone that I have that has some sort of like pain in their lower back or especially asymmetric, I'm going to assume that they're going to be off. Sometimes they aren't, and then I'm really confused, but almost always that displays. Okay? Now, does that mean that he'll never go back out? No, of course not. But at least now I have him to where I can assume I can get things to fire the right way. Okay, so he comes up. And then he's going to show me what it is. So first he's going to walk around and he's going to be like, oh my god, it's fixed.
Feels pretty fixed.
Yeah, okay, but that's fine. So now we're going to have him squat. We're going to see, because he's a baseball player or an athlete, give them the show. Give them the booty meat show. Booty meat show. They don't need that show, okay? Rise and shine over there. Okay, so what we've been talking about with him, what's going on over here? It's so red.
That was from the sensitive skin.
We have very sensitive skin, Ryan. That's,
Okay,
can't help it.
what Eric and I were talking about this week is this idea of what's the position of the pelvis when you squat, and what's too much tilt versus neutral and tucked under. And the most important factor is that the spinal angle doesn't change. Okay? Do you want to be dumped into a heavy lordosis? No. But if your body knows this position and it's not painful, you want to keep it. So go ahead and squat. So right there, he changes. Right? It's subtle, but he changes. So we'll do a couple. You can see the butt, right? You see it start to go. He's still not in deflection. He's still not risky on the lumbar, but his spinal angle changes. So for the sake of us keeping symmetric loading on the tissues, we're going to just keep him in that world, which he likes because that's deeper than he wants to squat anyway. Okay? Okay. So I go, okay, we can get away with that, and that looks pretty good. So we load him. Okay? Now, he said, well, what about some breathing? What about some bracing exercises? Sure. Depending on where someone is at in their world, I may give them that, but for the sake of someone that I think is already athletic, I want to see how his body adapts, right? So, well, then, so let's not fuck around.
Language, please. This is going to be on YouTube.
Oh,
so.
sorry. Let's not fudge around. All right, we're going to give him an 80-pound goblet squat. Okay, good. Come up. Okay, do we see anything else going on now that we've loaded it? Spine looks good, but he's got like this little like
Deviation to the
left. Yeah, he's got some left, and then he corrects back to the right. Wobble button. We're not done. Come on, give me some reps. Okay, now that could be just because I just threw him into an 80-pound goblet squat. So we'll see if he cleans up, which he does, because he's aware that he's fucked up.
Squat 470, but can't goblet
Okay,
squat 80.
good.
Just
All right.
his deal.
So it moves pretty good. Now, did you get pain there?
No.
Okay, so we had no pain, went to a depth that looked reasonable. Was he in a completely stacked pelvis over diaphragm? Not really. He was a little bit anterior, but his angle didn't change. Did you feel like you were braced?
Decent.
Okay, so you felt like he was
really focused on.
Yeah, but you felt like this. You felt like the abs were tight.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not overthinking it. Abs are tight. You can get away with that range. Okay, cool. Let's say that he had pain then. Okay? Yeah. When I got towards the bottom, I felt pain. Give me, without the kettlebell, give me an exaggerated Instagram model butt.
Specialty.
Okay.
Next to
Come
the,
up. No.
that was worse.
Not that. Give me, kick it out first. Yeah, kick it, there you go. There you go. Now, bring it up like a stripper. There. Okay, yes, exactly. All right, so that's what he looks like when he has pain.
Education hour.
So now we become more aware of this being an issue. Okay? Should I load him here if he has no pain?
He's ever done.
Some people would say no, right? Don't load him. It's a shitty posture. Teach him that pelvic tilt. Get him really active there. Okay, he has no pain. I cleaned up the alignment. He doesn't have a shift. He's now not anti. If I saw him doing this, he's coming in, and his body starts going into this kind of turn, I know that there is some sort of an active torsion going on, right? One hip is starting to drop forward, one is trying to go back. That's guaranteed to throw him out of whack. He looks like he moves pretty well. Something else in his process is throwing him out. Okay, it's probably not his squat. But what do you do for recreation? Aside from drinking.
Yeah. Sprint.
Okay, runs,
Yeah.
swings back,
That's kind of when it.
throws ball.
You get adjusted on a regular basis?
I do not. No.
That's
I sure don't.
not good.
So,
Messing up, Eric.
so we have a handful of these things that are asymmetric that can be throwing him out, or in his running pattern. Okay, so let's say we're going to assume that he has some sort of thing going on, because that's what we're talking about, SI joint. We're not stabilizing here. So then we're going to take him into some basic, let's see what you look like in a dead bug. Oh, I'll let you crawl. I know you really want to crawl. Let's look at a basic dead bug. Okay, arms go up, legs go up. Okay, we're just going to hold this position, and all we're going to look at is what does he breathe when he's here. Okay, this is more advanced, right? If I was just checking his breathing, I could just put him here and watch and see what he does. Okay, but this is a review. We don't want to spend all day in the review segment. So he's got some belly breathing. He doesn't breathe a lot here. He doesn't pressurize posteriorly, but we're not worried about it. Bring it up. He's an athlete. Okay, go ahead and extend the opposite arm and leg. So what I'm going to look for in this is variability. Okay, I'm looking for something specific. I want to know if he does the right the same as the left. Okay. And if you guys want to come up and kind of look over the top of him, you're welcome to. We'll have him do it for a few reps to see if he gets tired.
More uncomfortable.
Would he show asymmetries without clicking at the hips?
Without what?
Clicking at the hips.
What do you
You know,
mean?
everybody who's got that sort of where they're offset, and if you haven't reset them or whatever it is, somebody you've got like doing a board or some sort of at-home program, they're doing these and their hips.
If I hadn't adjusted him to being neutral, like if they are off, are they going to show an asymmetry?
Well,
Keep going. We're not done.
will people show an asymmetry without that sort of click?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there can be muscular asymmetry, but I always look at that first.
Right.
Because if there is that, then I try to clean that up first to see if it cleans up. If there isn't that, then we have a rotational, a one-sided rotation, a muscularly, neurologically based asymmetry.
But most people with rotational dysfunction will tend to have like a click in their
keep
hips
going.
at the SI when they're trying to do something like this, right?
Yes, I would say probably, yeah. Yeah. Okay, he doesn't look bad. Does anyone see anything glaring
No.
that looks different left to right? Probably looks worse without his
glare
blurry
off
pants.
skin,
Yeah.
it's pale.
Less range of motion.
Yeah.
I feel more braced when I do when I go right arm and leg.
Okay, so that's a good point. We didn't see it, so what do we do next? How did that feel?
Well, I feel more braced when I go like that.
Okay, so we can think about that two different ways. He's either having to work harder that direction, right? I have to brace to be able to extend one arm away from the other one. Most basic exercise in humanity, right? But I don't have to work that hard on the other side. So in his mind, he's going, this is working awesome. I feel it, right? And in my mind, I'm going, okay, his deep system's working better on the side he didn't have to think about.
So he doesn't feel like he's bracing.
So
as
I
much
think
on
his
that side.
oblique, his anterior oblique is having to overpower his deep stabilizers on the side where he feels like he's bracing.
Huh.
Oh,
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now,
Stupid idiot.
let's just, for the sake of argument, let's test it. Okay?
Oh,
so,
let's.
dead bud. What side did you say you were bracing on? Okay. So, what's your favorite nursery rhyme?
Ooh, man, so many. I honestly can't.
Okay, we're gonna go with Mary Had a Little
Okay,
Lamb.
yeah, let's do that one.
I'm gonna have you sing Mary Had a Little Lamb. Okay? And all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to push these away from each other, and you're gonna resist.
Okay, so I'm.
You're just
Pulling back
trying. You're
in.
trying to stay in the same exact position. Okay? Do you remember the lyrics? Even if you only know the first one, just repeat it. It's on camera. Go ahead. What's a ginger boy sound like?
Very gingerly.
Mary had a little. Keep going. See it. Come on.
What's
Keep going. Just keep saying.
Keep
Mary
saying
Had a
little
Lamb.
lamb over and over.
How about happy birthday? You know happy birthday?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Happy birthday to you.
Okay, he's bracing, right? All right.
He's straightening the right leg too.
Yeah. Keep going.
Happy birthday to.
Okay. Now, tried to brace on both. Go ahead. Keep going.
Happy birthday.
You're not. No.
You're
Stop.
right.
Stop. No. Sing. Sing.
You're not singing, Eric. This is why I played with Scott.
Yeah, that's it.
Happy
That's it.
Go ahead.
I would sing.
Go ahead. Sing.
Sing like a bird.
Okay. So, the test gives us a different theory now. Now we look and we go, okay. My initial thought is if he's having to think about bracing on the side he feels it, that may be a cheating side, right? But strength-wise, he was weaker on the side he does not feel himself bracing. Okay, so that's a weaker sling. All right.
So
Could we argue some deep abdominal stuff? Sure. But when I pushed those away, it was like smearing a nice piece of warm butter on a piece of toast, just whoop,
Oh yeah.
right? And this one was like, me trying to ride a mountain bike over.
Yeah, like at the restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. You have to like dig
On a-
in
on
and
a
then
soft
chop it,
roll
and then it
too.
digs
Yeah,
into the bread.
it's
You get
not
what I'm saying.
Daisy, do you get this analogy? You see what we're saying?
Yes.
See, I
Okay,
am
good.
the roll in the bread.
Ryan's
Together.
butter.
Ryan's.
The
Right
motion is the
yourself
butter.
on air,
The motion
yeah.
is the butter. Yes. Yes. Okay. So now we have something going on. Okay. But you can't have a AOS without a POS. Okay. So you're a POS. Flip over.
What does that stand for?
Piece of shit.
Thank you, player.
Posterior obliques. All right. So
Right shoulder's tight.
we had.
Looks like it, huh?
Yeah.
We had our sling that went left arm to right leg was weaker, right? So our posterior oblique sling offsets that. If I'm pushing through an anterior oblique, I'm pulling through the posterior oblique. That's what's generating rotation or anti-rotation. So if I am weaker with this guy, then what's our theory? What do we think? Is our posterior going to be stronger than the other side or weaker?
I think
Who
this
knows?
one's going to be weaker because that's kind of what it feels like.
The
when
same
it's
side
running.
weaker.
Yeah.
Okay, so his entire
Could've given us a
diagonal
cheat
line.
code here.
360 degrees around his body is weaker on that line. But let's check it. Bring this, yes.
No, I was just feeling.
Oh, sure.
What's your question?
Bring this to my knee.
Don't raise your hand. Let's
So
do it
you're
on
gonna
foot.
do a lat pull down.
Okay.
Okay, pull into my knee.
Just
Alright.
with that.
Yeah, pull down. Okay, so I got lat. Posterior sling goes lat to glute. He's gonna raise this leg. Okay, he's gonna hold that, and I'm gonna test him. Okay. I'm testing you. You gotta work for it.
Oh,
Got it?
right. Okay.
Ready? Okay, not bad. Okay, pull in. Good. Leg up. Hold. Pretty good. That's stronger, right? That looks stronger. So both were pretty good. Both were pretty good, but he was stronger on that side. So he has a deficit here. Okay? In this small big glute. Okay, so let's break down what's your sport of choice.
Yeah, let's go with baseball.
Okay, so he likes baseball. Please see my baseball. You see my baseball? Okay. You swing left to right or right to left?
Left to right.
Okay, swing left to right.
He throws right, hits left. So this
Okay,
is
so this is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because he's a switch hitter. Good for you. Good for you. Come on up.
Gotta keep
All right, so this is kind of fun to look at an athlete in the specifics of. Go ahead and just walk yourself through a swing pattern. Okay, do a handful of these. Make it look fluid. Okay.
Get a home run first.
Okay, now realistically, we're looking at this. This is how he swings. What slings are we using? The stronger side or the weaker side?
Weaker side on this one.
Stronger side.
Anterior is
Yeah,
weaker
no, weaker
side.
side.
So he's swinging to his weak. So he's using his weaker side,
And then stronger side.
but it was his stronger posterior sling. Okay. So when he's swinging, likelihood is he is dominating his swing through the pole. Okay.
Through the POS.
Through the POS, right? Which
Piece
I
of
would
shit,
take it.
yeah.
You probably want to do, right? You're not
Yeah.
trying to
I'm not.
hit this way. You're trying to pull through the ball.
Mhm.
So that's good.
Too, though, because then if I throw that way, then I'm
So now
pulling
he's
through the
pulling
stronger
through his
side.
through his anterior oblique on his stronger side. So he throws, right? That's his stronger sling anteriorly. He swings with an emphasis on pulling through, and he is stronger on that posterior sling. Okay? All right, we figured it out. But
Everything is working.
right, so but it doesn't matter because that's his line. So
Yeah.
the reality is he's probably going to end up fucked up in symmetric movement patterns, right? He could probably swing and throw for days, but the moment you load him symmetrically, you potentially are going to have that asymmetry show up. Yeah.
You usually see that where one line in a loop is stronger, or if it's like if my AOS on that side stronger with the opposite.
Well, you throw and hit the same way, right?
Right.
Okay, let's see. Dead bug. Do you want to warm up the dead bug, or do you want to just test it?
Oh, we're just gonna go right into it.
Okay. Do anyone else want to test it? I don't have to be the only one. Anyone wants to test it?
Any songs? Any requests?
You just want to watch me do it?
Twinkle, little star.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star?
Oh, I do. Couple of stars.
Okay. Bring your hand. Okay, good. Right there. All right. Twinkle it.
Twinkle, twinkle, oh, I forgot.
Right. We're also gonna actually.
Ready?
Little star. Well, what's the next verse?
How I wonder what you are.
That's way better than me.
What do we got?
Up above the world.
Up above the world, so high.
Like a diamond in the
Like-
sun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Shine bright like a
But-
diamond.
Yeah.
Yeah.
he is weaker. Not as dramatic, but he is weaker on this sling.
The same one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's vote.
Oh, they're twins.
But we expect that because you guys both hit this. You guys both throw the same
Yeah.
one, right? Or do you hit the same one?
No, I hit right.
No, yeah, throw righty and then he hits righty and hits left.
Okay. So our argument is if we are throwing and hitting the same way, his opposite one should be. You should be stronger here. This is his swing side, right? So let's see. Bring this to my knee. Pull down by the lat. Okay. Lift this leg. Hold strong. Hold strong. Resist. Okay, not bad. And from there, lift this leg. Resist. Weaker.
Yep.
Okay. We also noticed that you guys have last week. You guys had different smaller butt cheeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Okay. Which means, which was the smaller butt cheek?
My right.
Okay.
And that was the stronger one.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, because mine was my left and that was.
That was your weaker. That was your weaker one.
Mhm.
Okay. So not always completely locked, tied in.
No, wait,
Might
no,
be-
my right one was my weaker one. As well. Yeah. And my left one was smaller.
Yeah. So we could be overactive lat. We could also be looking at the other sides of what's going on with the glute, which is external rotation and extension. Okay. But for the most part, if we make the argument that your throwing and swinging is creating a dominant pattern, is that surprising to anybody? How many balls have you thrown in your life?
Tons.
How many times have you swung a bat?
Right.
Have you swung or thrown the other direction as much? Or even trained like you go, okay, I know I'm going to hit 200 balls at BP. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to do cable rotations 200 times the opposite direction. Nope. No, probably doesn't happen. Okay? Did it mean that he has no function and isn't allowed to do anything bilaterally in the gym? No, but it's starting to give us a roadmap as to what we need to fight. Okay, that being said, were either of them seem so drastically different that we need to train them asymmetrically? And what I mean by that is 3 rounds or 4 rounds of one side compared to 1 round on the other side.
Maybe a couple extra rounds for one or something.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Would you do it as a part of the routine or as a prep?
Probably both. I might do an activation and then throw in an extra set.
It's only because you guys know you're going to start doing it.
Yes,
I
sir.
have bought in.
I would probably be more tuned in, especially if I was training myself that way, to how it felt when I did the movement patterns,
Right.
than necessarily getting more volume, because you're perfectly capable of doing the exercise. So let's pick a posterior oblique exercise.
Half kneeling row.
Half kneeling row. Okay. If we're doing a half kneeling row, what side are we rowing to? What arm is pulling?
Doesn't matter which one. You want me to just we'll say left?
Well, comparatively.
Oh,
If I'm pulling with an arm,
Contralateral.
contralateral to the up leg,
Down leg.
down leg, right? Because if I'm in this position, I want to use this glute to lock extension, right? Active left glute. Right side lat activation. I could put rotation in here if I want, but I'm trying to connect to these two posteriorly, right? I could also potentially do a chop pattern to the high leg, keeping this active, pulling through that lat. Okay. A couple other options I could do there, bird dog row.
For the AOS? The chop?
Pull.
Oh, okay.
Pull, right? Don't always think about it just being this action, right? I typically cue the chop pattern through the pulling arm. Okay. Bird dog row, right? Those are all kind of unique ways to do it. You don't even necessarily have to be that specific. I have people do 3-point rows where I get them to kind of sit back and load up in the hips, and then ideally, I just get them to open that glute up and turn it into a lat to glute. So you can get as creative as you want, right? But I want to know what they're feeling, and I want to look at what their body position is doing. So let's take bird dog row. Either one, I don't know. Somebody come over. I'll do it. Okay, so grab strong enough. Grab a 40 pounder. Yes. Okay. You know what a bird dog row is?
Well, it depends on how you want, like, you want certain every or
Start both knees on bed. Yeah, good. All right, so this is the weaker side.
I forgot already.
What's your weaker side?
I forgot already.
Showing you nothing.
Yeah, so let's do strong side first. Let's do strong side first. Because ideally it needs to work on this side, right? So he extends the leg, fires the glute, gives me a row. Okay? Okay. So what I'm looking for is the scapula moves nicely, not shrugging, he's got good glute, he's not overly rotating the hips. Right? Okay, that's pretty good. Reasonable. You can argue that. Okay, switch that. I know what I think I'm going to see, but let's just see what we see. Okay. You want to see what's going on here? That lumbar is starting to get into a little extension as he pulls. Okay? Because the lat doesn't want to do his job as much. Right? He's got decent glute, the lat. So, drive to tight the abs there. Now, does that feel weaker when you go into that position? When I force you out of that?
I feel like I accidentally glute more.
You got better glute,
Yeah. I guess.
but then you took some of the lumbar out, took some of that thoracic lumbar
Yeah.
fascia activation. See that a lot with compensation of glute is lumbar. Compensation of lat is lumbar. QL. Any of that stuff that is the posterior superficial meat in the lower back that sits between those two connections. Because the body's going to figure out how to do it. Yeah, give me a Seaman special. Give me a Seaman special.
You have no idea how. Just wait.
How do you set? Figure out how to set it up. Good latch. Good. Okay.
Yeah,
Good. So this is kind of a double, right?
stairs up with the dive.
It's posterior oblique. Now let's make this a little more AOS. Hold that. Typically, people let their legs flare out. It's counterbalance. But see if he's able to fire here. So we can run shot. Yeah, so he's having a hard time fighting me. And he's got a smaller patio on the right side. Now you're gonna get a complex about your titties too. He's got a little smaller patio on the right. He doesn't fire the other. Okay? But reasonable. So here's the thing. That exercise in and of itself is pretty complex, right? So if I wanted to bring it down a little bit to where I really wanted it to be that anterior oblique dominance only, how can I manipulate that unilateral? Okay, so here's nice. We already have that. Yeah. So same basic exercise. I've taken kind of the posterior chain out a little bit. So I'll bring this in just this one.
I would suggest maybe.
I'm just going to give him some feedback on that. So I'm not necessarily trying to make him have adductor skills, but I'm trying to get to make sure that he's using it as a part of that AOS.
Would this off leg, like you want it here, or would that?
It will make a difference subtly, but not enough for the fact that if we did this on both sides, we should get to similar. Okay. So if he was doing this on his own, he could string it to a thing. The other thing he can do is we can just take the bolt out of it. Add a little more aggressive oblique sling in. Squeeze it, legs up. Squeeze. Okay. So now he's got a shit ton of oblique going on here, right? So you can see how hard he has to work to not fall over. Now I can give him all sorts of feedback here, right? This is a little 6-pound ball. He can barely hold this and be active, so I have to coach him to be like, make sure you're squeezing this. But if I had like that heavy medicine ball, if I had like a 20-pounder, 30-pounder, he'd have to work his ass off to hold on. Okay. If I want to regress that and not have it be as oblique driven, but still fire that sling, I just leave the feet down. Still squeezing, still adductor. Still press, still pec, to oblique, to internal oblique, to adductor. It's still happening. It's just a little more press, right? Okay. So again, we can look for compensation patterns. Is he letting that knee just kind of flop open, right? Is he twisting his body off the ground? Is he in it? Is he unable to keep his shoulders square to the ground? See that a lot with the obliques. People press, and as they're pressing, the shoulder, as their weight comes down, their shoulder is like creeping off the floor. They can't maintain that anti-rotational path. Okay? So all of those are isolating those things even throughout. My goal is that we're getting in. So next week, let's maybe go a little
can. Way to do things.
Ryan, which side does that weaker on again? I totally forgot. I know. POS, I think
Recall
is
you
this
were
way.
both weak with left arm to right leg.
Yeah.
Anterior.
Anterior.
Posterior you were
So
opposite.
I was opposite. So I
That
was
was the
weaker.
same.
Okay, interesting. So that's weird because the right glute is the one that doesn't extend.
Okay, so then we can certainly talk about like those positions because you go, okay, what's your better oblique?
On the back? Oh, okay. Yeah, left to right.
Left to right your better
Yeah.
oblique, right? Adductor ties into what?
No, I think I think my better oblique sling on the front was right to left.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are those tie? What is the adductor also tie into?
Lateral.
Laterally it ties into psoas.
Oh,
So
okay.
if I'm weaker in this line, I may be guarding this whole position with my hip flexor.
Weaker through this line. So
My hip flexor may be underestimated compensating. So my hip flexor is tight. If I get a harder time extension. So then we start calling a straight roadmap. This button doesn't work because my better sling. It works when I down regulate front sling by actually lat and the glute extension. But when the sling is firing, the hip flexor is trying to do work to stabilize me because my adductor and the sling is working.
yeah.
It might be offsetting my ability to be extended over low.
Interesting. Okay. Cool.
Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe not.
Yeah.
Who knows? All right.
That's good, man.
The backhand.
You guys are idiots.
Backhand. Backhand. Lori, let's get on this bike.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do that.
What are you doing over there?
Oh, really?
I don't know what she's doing.
That's kind of like articulating.
Yeah, that sounds like exactly